I am coming at this project, this topic, as somebody who is working on two projects with the National Park Service that I think have helped me focus on trends in the field. One is I'm editing with Diane Miller a new interpretive handbook for the Park Service about the Underground Railroad. And the other is I'm working on a project about slave stampedes or large group escapes with Dan Johnson. These are both part of our digital work here at House Divided and our classroom efforts, but I feel like they've given me a chance to think much more deeply about certain questions or challenges that have come up in the last 30 years in the field. Let's start, for example, with this Park Service handbook. What the Park Service likes to do in projects like this is distill for a general audience what scholars have been working on in the field. It's been a long time since they've done one of these interpretive handbooks on the Underground Railroad. Some of you may have seen they've done some work like this recently on topics like Reconstruction. But what we have been focusing on in organizing this handbook, which should be out next year, is trying to build on two different kinds of trends. One, I think, is kind of regional. One of the great developments in the last generation or so of scholars working, especially in the antebellum American field, is that there's been a greater awareness and exploration of how there are regional networks, not just of safe houses, but of people and communities of people working to help runaways escape across borderlands, not just from the upper South to Canada, but across the United States on the Western frontiers, in maroon communities, on the coasts. It is a much more diverse experience than, classroom or textbook traditions have often been able to cover. And the Park Service has been determined to try to find a group of scholars who can help distill that. And then on the thematic front, there's all kinds of complexities that have emerged in the last generation. I have a particular interest in the federalism issue. Very few people seem to realize that in many ways, state laws matter more than federal laws when it comes to fugitive slaves, at least in the United States, especially after 1850. The notorious and draconian 1850 law has this overwhelming reputation. And yet the truth is far more enslaved people, far more freedom seekers, far more people who tried to help them were persecuted under state laws like slave stealing statutes than under the federal code. The Northern personal liberty laws, the efforts to try to prevent the application of the federal law, was far more effective than I think many people realize. And the battle over Northern states' rights versus the federal law is an important component, of understanding fugitivity in the antebellum period. And all of that, I think, is about the coming of the war and the role the fugitive crisis played in it. We have a number of authors who are working at explaining those connections, not just the coming of the war itself, but also the coming of emancipation during the war as fugitivity continued into the 1860s. So there are a number of people who've been working on this. I mean, Kelly Jackson is one of them. She's a part of this handbook and she's on this panel. So she'll talk about that, the role of violence and the role of communities of people using all sorts of tools to resist the laws that they thought of as unjust. We're also looking to figure out ways to talk about the memory and the memory of freedom and freedom seekers and how that's evolving over the years. So I wanted to introduce that idea, and pose it as a kind of question to the audience, the people who are interested in this panel, which is, if you were going to think about an interpretive handbook for the general public that would distill some of the greatest trends in recent scholarship on fugitivity, dating back to like John Hope Franklin and Lauren Schwenniger's book on runaway slaves, or Gary Collison's biography of Shadrach Minkins, in the years since then, what are the trends in the scholarship that you think people should become more aware of? What are the themes that are most pressing and least understood? And then in terms of my other project, I just wanted to mention very quickly, you know, I think most people have heard the phrase slave stampedes. Uh, it's a term that you know, gets bandied about occasionally. It's not something that's commonly analyzed. But we've been working on a project with the Park Service for the last couple of years that's tried to figure out exactly what contemporary Americans thought the term slave stampede meant. It's a phrase that derives, you know, from Spanish origins. It was a metaphor that was originally part of the Western frontier and started to get applied in the 1840s and 50s to a variety of topics like politics or like runaway slaves. Um, and yet it was far more common than you might imagine, the term being used to describe mass or large group escapes. Just in the 2 years we've been working on and researching for this project, we've uncovered what looks like about 200 different stampedes identified from across the country, mostly from the Upper South, involving about 12,000 freedom seekers. Um, the, the role of these stampedes is incredibly important to the sectional propaganda of each side. Of course, slave holders use the term as a way to kind of dehumanize the freedom seekers, but abolitionists and their allies use the term as a way to defy and provoke the slaveholders. And both sides seem to recognize the power of this metaphor, that slave stampedes were like a form of almost mobile insurrection. And it's somewhere in the dynamic of how we characterize resistance to slavery, from day-to-day revolt to large insurrections, we should situate this concept of group escapes, because it was far more common and far more commonly talked about than you might imagine. When John Brown launched his raid at Harper's Ferry, many of the original newspapers covering it called it an attempted slave stampede at first. When contrabands started appearing at Fort Monroe in 1861, the magazines and newspapers covering it, before they started talking about contrabands, they started talking about slave stampedes. So, you know, it's just a reminder to all of us that there's a lot of complexity behind these subjects, especially in the antebellum period, I think, that we are still struggling to figure out how to convey to the wider public, to classrooms. And so I was hoping to see if as well anybody has been talking about or teaching about slave stampedes in their work, or the idea of group escapes and what they might mean in our understanding of resistance to slavery.